You're just in time to discover a miraculous run in National Football League history as we study the 1965 season and the eventual winning team, the Green Bay Packers. Guest tonight is Bob Swick from Gridiron Greats magazine. Bob's up in just a moment to tell us all about the 1965 season.
This is the Pigskin Daily History Dispatch, a podcast that covers the anniversaries of American football events throughout history. Your host, Darren Hayes, is podcasting from America's North Shore to bring you the memories of the gridiron, one day at a time.
Hello, my football friends. This is Darren Hayes of PigskinDispatch.com. Welcome once again to the Pig Pen, your portal to positive football history, and welcome to our NFL Championship Series, the games before the Super Bowl that claimed the title for the National Football League. And as always, we have guest experts from the team that won the championship that year coming on to tell us about their teams and the seasons that they defeated everybody else in the National Football League. Tonight, we were at the 1965 season, the last one in our series, and we have our guest that's been with us all the way through here, talking multiple times about the Packers, and that's Bob Swick of the Gridiron Greats magazine and Gridiron Greats podcast. Bob, welcome back to the Pig Pen.
Thanks, Darren. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, Bob, 65 is just such an exciting season, not only in being a Packers fan, but in the National Football League, because it's sort of the end of an era. The National Football League standing on its own, and the next year they're starting to merge in with the AFL. So really a milestone moment for pro football.
Very much so. It's a classic NFL season in the sense of what you stated, and also with the traditional East-West conferences of the league. And the last championship where the East and West winners will actually claim the NFL title. So it is truly the end of an era, the true end of pure football, as I call it, when you didn't have AFL teams or AFC teams playing NFC teams, NFL teams, so on and so forth. What made this season, in my opinion, so spectacular, especially for the Packers, is a little known fact is there was a playoff game for the West Championship because the Baltimore Colts and the Green Bay Packers both ended up in the season 10 wins, 3 losses, and 1 tie. So they were forced to play a playoff game in Green Bay the day after Christmas. And that game actually went into overtime, where the Packers, Don Chandler at the time, who had taken over the kicking duties for the Packers in the 65 season, kicked the field goals, and the Packers won the West title in that game, and they got the chance to play the Cleveland Browns in a championship game the day after New Year's on January 2nd in 1966. So it's something that is sometimes forgotten, but the Packers had a rough time that season. Their offense wasn't at full throttle, meaning that they weren't top 5 in offense. They were number 12 in offense, but for defense, they were the number 3 defense in the NFL. And there's one statistic to me that really always astounded me as far as the defense was concerned, that the Packers had 44 sacks in the season and 27 interceptions. So they were number 3 in the league in sacks, but they were number 1 in the league with interceptions. And that's truly a testimony to the great defense that the Packers had in 65 over their offense, in which Bart Starr didn't have a bad year, but he didn't have one of his best years either at the same time. So that's kind of the scenario we have going into that championship game that year. And I always found it ironic, as I studied this season years later, is how the Colts and the Packers could end up tying on the last game of the season, because the Packers on the last game of the season ended up tying the 49ers on December 19th, 24-24. And I just found that amazing. And for whatever reason, the Packers had a rough time on the West Coast. I think it was because they were out of their element. They're out of the cold. They're in the warm weather. I think it just had for whatever reason, they had a rough time playing out there toward the end of the season.
Well, the 49ers weren't, slouches. They weren't gimme games either. So they were a
Correct.
good team. So, and maybe there's just a little bit of letdown, the end of the season, and you're anticipating, going into the postseason. But that's not a given when you're tied with the Colts, going into that. You're that
Exactly.
close. You can get knocked out in the regular season and not never make it to the postseason back then when there was only, one team from each conference going in, unless you tied.
Correct. And Lombardi was very upset, in reading over the years. He was very upset that they tied that game. If they had only won the game, they would have won the conference. There was no need for that playoff game. So they had to get themselves ready the next week for the playoff game. And that was a rough game for them because they were losing at halftime 10-0. And then they basically came back in the second half. The Colts started to fade, and they tied the game up. And Chandler kicked the field goal in overtime, so they could win that playoff game to get the West Conference title. So it was a little, trying to reading some of the articles from that time frame and reading some of the quotes of Lombardi. Although Lombardi always remained positive no matter what the situation was. He did realize that this team had issues, and they did come together though, and they did win when they needed to win, and that's what it was all about back then in a 14-game season. So Lombardi, was able to, in my opinion, use the defense to his advantage over an offense that really, it wasn't a bad offense. It was just an offense that was not typical of the Packers and their powerful running game. Jimmy Taylor, first year, I believe he didn't run for 1,000 yards that season, which was unheard of. Hornig was slightly off. They did do much better with the field goals because Chandler took over the kicking of the field goals after Hornig's very poor season in 64. I believe he missed either 23 or 26 field goals in 64, and Lombardi couldn't have it anymore, so he went with Chandler on that. But still, they were a strong team. There's no doubt about it. And again, 63, they were 11-2-1. They were in second place. 64, they were 8-5-1. They were in second place. So here's a team that since 1960 was either in first place or second place. So, that's a powerful statement. And again, looking ahead, which we really shouldn't, but we do, 66 and 67, the 3 in a row deal, the 3 in a row crowns. So it's a credible statement to the Packers and to Lombardi's coaching ability and the players themselves.
Yeah, it's interesting what you said earlier. You're talking about how the defenses, and talking about, they were near the top of the league in pressure, near the top of the league in takeaways, and those sort of go hand in hand. You put pressure on the opposing quarterback, they're going to make some mistakes or throw some balls, or maybe normally if they weren't under pressure, they wouldn't put them in places like that, just trying to get it out of their hands so they don't get slaughtered by some big behemoth coming in to take their head off. So it's
Exactly. And again, turnover, as much as turnovers have been part of football since the beginning of football, in the 60s, the Packers, to me, really, their defense understood the value of a turnover, the value of a fumble, the value of holding, 3 downs and making them punt, the value of an interception, and trying to get some yardage on it. Just don't catch the ball and kneel down right away, type of thing. Trying to build some presence and yardage to get better field position, get the points, get the touchdown, get the field goal. So, they played an aggressive defense, which I think was a norm for many teams in the 60s, much more prevalent than what we see today. But at the same time, they literally perfected it. And again, you had guys like Herb Adderley, Lionel Aldridge, Tom Brown, Willie Davis, Henry Jordan, Willie Wood. And you had some classic defensive players for that team. And as such, they really gelled uh, that season, 66 and 67, and really helped the Packers, be as successful as they were for that time frame.
Okay, yeah. So let's talk about the opponents in the championship game. The Browns. How was their season, and what did they have to overcome?
Well, the Cleveland Browns were led by a gentleman by the name of Jim Brown, which I think we all know pretty well. And Brown basically retired after that season, which was a shock to NFL, to football, so on and so forth. He got tired of the game. He had outside interests. He didn't like getting beat up anymore. Whatever you want to look at why he left when he left, and he was done. So the Browns really thought that they would have an opportunity for Jim Brown to go out on top, because they really felt they could beat the Packers. They had a belief that Jim Brown was the best running back for the NFL, and his actual playing and his actual picking above yardage, scoring touchdowns, so on and so forth, would be, the key to that particular game. Now, Jim Brown that year had 1,544 rushing
Mm,
yards, which is
wow,
incredible for
sure
14
is.
games, if you think about it. And he had 17 rushing touchdowns, but he also had 4 receiving touchdowns at the same time. So
Mm,
Brown was part of the reason why the Cleveland Browns had 11 wins and 3 losses that year. They had a good quarterback in Frank Ryan. I wouldn't say Ryan was one of the best in the NFL. He wasn't one of the worst. But Frank Ryan handed the ball off to Jim Brown and let
mm.
Jim handle, running up fields and running rampant and getting scoring and so on and so forth. So again, if you're putting it in context, the Browns had a relatively good team going into the championship game. My gut feeling, and again, trying to, reading a lot of the information of that time, going over a lot of articles at the time, I think they were overconfident when they went into Green Bay for the game. I really felt they really thought they were going to win, and that was it. So what happens? They get to the game. You got 4 inches of snow on the ground. They got to sweep the ground off. So now, as the day progressed, it became a mud bowl because the conditions were so bad. I guess they had rain. There was melting, so on and so forth. So the Green Bay defense basically throttled Brown the entire game. He became a non-entity in the game. He became a non-factor. Yeah, he ran a few, and he didn't even score a touchdown in the game, but he was really limited in what damage he could do with the Packers. And I think Lombardi understood the key to winning this game was to stop Jim Brown, and they were successful with it. And there's one interesting statistic that really amazed me when I actually found it today. There were 69 plays for Green Bay in that game. Cleveland only had 39.
Wow.
And the score was 23 for Green Bay, 12 for the Browns. You would think it was a much closer game than what's indicated by the number of plays and the score itself. But realistically, the second half of the game, Cleveland was stymied. They couldn't do anything. It was all Green Bay from that point on. Green Bay scored 10 more points in the second half. They were leading at halftime 13-12. Cleveland never scored again in the second half. Green Bay rolled, and they got championship number 1 of 3 at that game. And again, the only touchdown for the Browns was not to Jim Brown, was Frank Ryan threw to Gary Collins, and Lou Groza kicked 2 field goals. And that was the extent of their scoring for
Mm.
the game. So it was a very lopsided second half. It was a competitive first half, but the second half, just the Packers defense took over completely, and Green Bay went into a little ball control with the bad weather and to try to stay on the field, wear down the Browns' defense, which was a relatively good defense, but it wasn't, again, one of the best in the NFL either. So it turned out well for Green Bay. It turned out well for the Packers with regards to staying, or I'm sorry, it turned out well for the defense of the Packers because they just played their game. And that was it. They had confidence in themselves. They knew they could shut down Jimmy Brown, and they did. And I think that was the key to that entire championship game. Getting to Brown, making him a non-entity in the game, caused the Packers, or helped the Packers to win the game with ease.
Yeah, when you're sort of a one-dimensional team and somebody takes away that, that star player or that, that big play, it really makes teams, wilt. Or sometimes it makes them find themselves and find other weapons and other ways to score. Looks like the Browns maybe wanted to try to do that with Ryan a little bit. They knew they had to put the ball in here, and that's how they maybe scored. But had definitely taken away the best weapon. That was one of Belichick's famous lines. His philosophy:
Correct.
every game,
Correct.
you can take away whatever their key player is, and that makes your life a lot easier for your defense.
Oh, exactly, exactly. And I think Lombardi was just so far ahead in his concept of that back in the early 60s or even in the 50s when he was with the Giants and handling them. He understood that, and he carried over that philosophy as a head coach to both the offense and the defense with regards, you got to focus in on where their strong points are. Let's take out those strong points and we're going to be more successful winning. Which is why I know I'm prejudiced. Vince Lombardi to me was such a great coach. He was so brilliant in his decision making, and he understood what 22 men were on that field. He understood what all 22 men were doing simultaneously. And I've always said that because I really believe. Again, he was a genius in coaching for what he did. He was so focused on understanding what the strengths were of that other team and to eliminate those strengths in the game so you could win, type of thing. And again, his entire career, sadly so short with the Packers. He only had a couple of bad, if you want to call it bad seasons. He had a couple losing, he didn't even have a losing season. He had a season that he didn't win the championship. Let's put it that way. So he had a couple seasons he did not win the championship, but he was consistently winning games by all means, using that strategy of, let's eliminate this, let's eliminate that, we'll go forward, we're going to win the game. And that to me, that was classic for that 65 championship game.
Yeah, very fascinating. Now I'm going to ask you a question because I mean, this game was played a year before I was born. So I can't appreciate the way the 65 season
Okay.
was. But we know through history that, a year later, the merger starts to happen. They're
Right.
playing a world championship game. It's not the Super Bowl yet, but we call it Super Bowl one. But what was the feeling like in that era? Was there a feeling that, hey, this AFL and NFL, they're going to merge at some point, or was it sort of people kind of satisfied with having these two different leagues playing two different styles of ball and just enjoying football?
Well, I think now that I look at it, and again, I got a few years on you because 1965 was the first year I was opening up wax packs at 7 years old of football cards and watching, games on TV. So it was fascinating to me that there were two separate leagues. And I kind of liked the idea there were two separate leagues. And there was some talk that going back to 63 and 64, maybe the two leagues should merge or the two leagues should play a championship game against one another and have a championship of the world type of thing. So what was happening in 65, which was interesting, a lot of cities wanted AFL franchises. So the AFL was still only 8 teams, and they were hesitant to expand anymore. And the NFL was saying to themselves, okay, so maybe we should start bringing in more teams to try to suffice and eliminate the AFL threat of two teams, so on and so forth, in the same city. For example, Milwaukee wanted an AFL team because Green Bay was only playing a few games a year there. They were still considered the Green Bay Packers. And eventually and this didn't take place until the 90s, they got rid of all their games in Milwaukee and play all the games in Green Bay. But at one time, they split their time. They played games in Milwaukee because they had a bigger stadium. And then they played games in Green Bay, even though they were still the Green Bay Packers. Milwaukee, a group of people wanted an AFL franchise in 1965, and they talked to AFL Commissioner Joe Foss at the time, and he was receptive to a lot of things, to listening, to try to, maybe we'll do this, maybe we'll do that. So the NFL, don't forget, jumped the gun and brought in the Atlanta Falcons, and the Falcons, believe it or not, and I just discovered this the last week in doing research for this. The Falcons asked Lombardi if he would be interested in taking over the head coaching and GM position of the new franchise. And Lombardi said no, so he recommended, I believe his name was Norm Heckler from his staff, to be the coach, and he ended up being, I believe, the first coach for the Falcons at the time. But Lombardi was loyal to the Packers. He was also hit up by the Redskins at the time to take a position. And Lombardi ended up taking that Washington position because he wanted financial security. He never felt secure enough financially in Green Bay. And if Lombardi had just said to Green Bay, listen, I need financial security, I am confident the board of directors in 1967, 68 would have told Lombardi, whatever you want, give us a figure, we'll figure out a way to get it to you, and that's it. Whatever you want to do, so on and so forth. I mean, the man is like a god in Green Bay. I personally was so shocked when I heard he was taking over the Redskins. I was in just total disbelief that he would leave the Packers. So, that, created a whole brouhaha at that time. But getting back to your original question, there was a lot of purists. They liked the two leagues. And a lot of people didn't like the idea, knowing that in 1970, there's only one league now. And now 3 established NFL teams go into the American Conference, and then expansions, slowly but surely starts to expand the league to a great area that we have today, which is unfortunately in some cases very diluted talent because you got so many teams now. You know what I mean? But back
Right.
then it was pure football, and I'll tell you, I watched on a Sunday. I had the opportunity to watch, if I was lucky, 3 games, because there was an AFL and NFL game at the same time, and then the second game of the day was either an AFL or NFL, depending on what was going on. I lived at that time in North Branford, Connecticut, so I only got the Patriots, the Jets, the Giants. Those were the 3 teams that I saw, basically. So if the Jets were on the West Coast, I would normally get that on NBC television. If the Giants were on the West Coast, I would get that on CBS television. So I was very limited. I didn't have Red Zone in 1965 or anything else. And many times I would have the game on TV, and I would have my little transistor radio in my ear, because I could pick up one of the other game that wasn't on TV. So I would be listening to both games. And my father always was astounded me doing that, but he left me alone because he knew I thoroughly enjoyed football. And Saturday, the same thing. I would watch it. Any college game that was on TV, I would watch it. I mean, I was just fascinated with the game. So, but again, I'm off on different tangents here.
No,
It was it
It's
was.
fascinating because what you said, just what you said between having the Patriots and Jets being AFL teams and the Giants NFL, and you're sort of in the middle of their markets there in Connecticut.
I
It's
exactly
very
in the middle.
similar to what people here, in Erie, we're 100 miles away from Cleveland, Buffalo, and
Yeah,
Pittsburgh.
yeah,
And
yeah.
we had a very similar thing. And some older gentlemen than I have told me before, hey, you were either an allegiant to the AFL if you were a Bills fan, or you were an NFL guy because Browns and Steelers. It
Right.
wasn't you had your team uh, patriotism and philosophies, of supporting your teams, but you also had league pride. You had to carried the shield, or you carried the banner of the AFL.
Right,
Kind
right.
of kind of interesting, the dynamic.
And that's why a lot of people never could never understand, how did you become a Packers fan in North Branford, Connecticut? Well, I used to read the New Haven Register and New Haven Journal Courier, the morning paper, the night paper. And Bob Soronsky, who played for the Packers, was from Derby, Connecticut. So the Register and and Journal Courier would really literally once a week have a nice Packer feature on Soronsky, the family, so on and so forth. And long story short, they were winning, and I thought it was fascinating. In their football cards, they had green and yellow uniforms, which I had black and white TV. I had no clue what anybody's colors were or anything like that, and unless I got like a Sports Illustrated or a sports magazine, and I could see a color photo of the game. So I said, well, the Packers are winning. I like it. I like Bob Soronsky. I've read so much about him. So let me, I'll root for the Packers. A point later on in my life, and this was kind of weird. I worked at a transit district in Milford, Connecticut. My boss was from Derby, and we got to talking. Long story short, he was a Packer shareholder. I was a Packer shareholder. We had a lot of similarities in our lives. And he says, "Well, I know the Soronsky family very well." And he said, "Let's write to Bob and see if he'll send us some photos with his autograph on it." And we got in the mail like a week later. He hand wrote a letter to my boss, who he knew, and he sent us a bunch of photos, and he autographed mine to Bob. Uh, um, Bob Soronsky, and it was just really incredible to think about reading about him when I was 7 years old, and then fast forward 40 plus years later when I'm working, and I got an affiliation with him at the same time.
Hmm.
So truly amazing. But
Yeah.
I love the two leagues, the pureness of two leagues. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I was sad when they merged. I didn't know what was going to happen. 1970, I was kind of disappointed watching football because there weren't two leagues anymore. It was a conference. Now, well, that's different than a league type of thing.
Mhm.
And again, as you said, and I agree 100%. I had friends who were Jets fans. I had friends who were Giants fans. I had friends who were Patriots fans. And then I had a few people in between, like myself, who were Packer fans. I had knew a couple guys who were Cardinal fans because their parents were from St. Louis and they followed the team when they were in St. Louis, so on and so forth. So, but that's the fun of football, that you're not a homer all the time.
Yeah.
You follow a team because you like them, and they don't have to be necessarily in your location, in your geographical location.
Yeah, most definitely. But Bob, going back into this 65 season, earlier you had told us that you have some memorabilia from that
I
league,
do.
or from that era, and that team and that year. Maybe you could share those with us.
First thing I like to show is a Los Angeles Rams at Green Bay Packer game program. Their game programs at their time were basically they were pictures of the players and the teams, and there was always usually a Coca-Cola ad,
Mhm.
which was in color, which was part of the centerfold of it. And basically talked about the game and it had a lot of ads, so on and so forth. So it's very classic 50-cent program, believe it or not.
Yeah, that's kind of expensive for a program back then, wasn't it?
Exactly. Those two
Yeah.
quarters.
Yeah.
So it was for 1965. That is actually, a good chunk of change. But
Can
that's
tell they must have been doing well to for people paying that much to get a program. That's great.
well, they were selling a lot of them too at the same time. Now I also have the 65 Packers media guide. They called it back then a press guide. And these are not at all like what the media guides turned out to be today, which are like 300 page, literally small Bibles of the team with all the information. These were very, very minimal in information, 64 pages. They would show usually rosters, draft picks, players, team players, so on and so forth. Very short write up. But the one thing that was very interesting, if you can see it on the front page, these were issued in the 60s after the preseason because they have all the preseason scores of what the Packers did that year. And then it
Oh
goes into
yeah.
it. So that was the interesting part of these.
And I
So
see they played the Browns second to last preseason game too. A little
yeah, yeah.
precursor.
And it was at Cleveland, and Cleveland had double headers at that time. So there were two games at Cleveland Stadium. And the Packers that year won they won 4 out of the 5 preseason games. And Lombardi didn't like losing preseason games either, because he still felt it was a game and you were playing it. I do have, unfortunately, without the cover, 1966 press guide, and it's the same thing. It's interesting on the back pages of the guide, they had the entire player roster from 1921 on.
Wow.
Believe it or not. So this was very historical looking at it. They still do it, but back then it was like 4 pages of the media guide.
And I'm gonna imagine that the cover that's missing off that was probably hanging on somebody's wall somewhere.
Yeah, I was going to say that, and I got that in a trade years ago, and the guy said, "Do you mind? I don't have a cover on it." Yeah, I said, "I just want the inside information so I can read it." The 65 yearbook is a classic picture, but it's taken from 1962 of Curly Lambeau and Vince Lombardi. And Lombardi's congratulating Lambeau. He got elected to the Wisconsin Sports Hall of Fame in 1962. Lambeau died in 1965. So that's why they used it as a tribute to Lambeau on the yearbook itself. And then two last things I want to show. When I was a kid, I used to love reading paperback books of sports, and one of my favorite of all time runs was Football Stars for the year, and they would do little biographies of each player, and then they would have like a little section of photos, action photos. Notice how they're all black and white though, so I still didn't know what the colors were. And 1965. Jim Brown, the Cleveland Browns, on the front cover. Okay. Last year he played, don't forget, for the NFL. Go to 1966, and we got number 31, Jimmy Taylor, running the ball. So he took over the shoes of Brown. A lot of people said Taylor is going to be the best running back in the league since Jim Brown retired. So it's very interesting. I can't tell you how many times I read and reread those books when I was a kid. They were either 35 cents or 50 cents. And I remember bugging my parents for 2 quarters so I could buy the book. My mother would give in after a while. And she said, "Just give me the book. I'll check it out." And then I would wait patiently after she checked out. And by the time we got to the car, I took the book out, and I was trying to read it by the light of the cars behind me while we were driving home from the store there, and get started.
They probably told you, Bob, we'll give you 35 cents for the book, but we're not paying 50 cents for a program. Darn it.
Right,
We're
right,
draw the line somewhere.
right, right. I had an uncle who he knew I had a great love of sports books and stuff, so he he would pick up a sport magazine for me or Sports Illustrated and give it to me when I go over to their house. But just another quick story with him. He drove a bus for a living. So he would get all the newspapers during the day. And he would get the New York Daily News and the New York Post. And he would bring them home and save them. And back in those days, you just handed down in the family. So we would get them, and my mother and my father would read them. So I would pour over the sports, and it was classic, Joe Namath, Jets articles, so on and so forth. And it was just so fascinating to me to read, about New York football, because it was just a great time for football back then.
Yeah.
Great memories.
Absolutely. Well, Bob, I really I want to thank you for not only this episode coming on telling us about the Packers, but the other, I think you did 3 or 4 other Packers episodes, all the way stretching back to the 30s, I think. And we really appreciate you being a part of this series and helping to make this series such a special thing that hopefully people can enjoy for years to come, and try to pay attention to what was going on in pro football, especially in the National Football League and their championship games from 33 to 65.
I hope they do, because it's great football history. I'm glad you're able to preserve it and have the full gamut of individuals who follow football, study it, so on and so forth. I think it's great for the history of the game, and that's what it's all about. We want to preserve the history of this great game.
All right, Bob. So thanks again, and we will talk to you again real soon on maybe a different subject.
Okay, thanks.
That's all the football history we have today, folks. Join us back tomorrow for more of your football history. We invite you to check out our website, pigskindispatch.com, not only to see the daily football history, but to experience positive football with our many articles on the good people of the game, as well as our own football comic strip, Cleat Marks Comics. Pigskindispatch.com is also on social media outlets, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and don't forget the Pigskin Dispatch YouTube channel to get all of your positive football news and history. Special thanks to the talents of Mike and Gene Monroe, as well as Jason Neff for letting us use their music during our podcast.
This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.